One thing, though, that we can observe is that the closer the values, the closer, even for sharp edges,
Okay.
the closer the values are to each other, the less sharp we perceive those edges to be.
The word gradation means gradual change. Value gradation happens when any value becomes either lighter or darker in any direction. Every portion of that change is gradation. So even this little subtle area right here that gradually gets a tiny bit darker is a gradation. And it continues to gradate as it moves in this direction. The whole thing is a gradation. So you might say that a gradation begins when a change starts and ends where the change ends. Value gradation is caused by two conditions. Sometimes they are independent and sometimes they work together. One of those conditions is what we might call natural pigmentation. That's a big way of saying how it's colored. We can see here that this particular flower goes in by nature from a dark violet gradually, or this petal, from the dark violet gradually to a lighter violet. But the next condition is light. Now, in this photo of the same kind of flower, got a slightly different lighting. The light is stronger at the top than it is in this direction. Now, if you will notice what's happening, we do have the natural pigmentation. We have the darker violet moving to the lighter violet in various areas, but over here, it's moving in a different way. There's a different kind of gradation. Darker to darker. It's in a darker range, and it's closer. The gradation is not as far apart from one value to another than it is in our earlier version. Now here they are together, and you can see this one is more evenly lit. The lights and shadows are falling pretty evenly. In fact, it's more in a more even light, and the shadows are more underneath, whereas this one, the light is coming from a different direction. So we see these petals are thrown a little bit more into shadow, and we can see the gradation here is closer and in a darker area than it is, say, right over here. So those are the kinds of things that we pay attention to and learn to control as we're working on our paintings. So even though the pigmentation is important, it's not the main element. What causes us to see how that gradation, regardless of the pigmentation, what causes us to see how the gradation is behaving is how the light or how the light rays are hitting that particular image. This lesson then will focus on how light creates gradation and how the human eye responds to this. There are two major ways that the gradation of light functions in our vision and in nature. One is that it is the gradation of light that shows form. And we see this form, we recognize it as a pot. But do we recognize that it's the gradation of light that actually shows us the form? Without the gradation of light, we would see it simply as a flat shape. One of the major ways that light works to create gradation or shows us the gradation in nature is how it shows us atmosphere. Now, we see this in nature in a number of ways. But what is the light revealing to us here? And how is it revealing? It's revealing fog moving in. And the way it's revealing it as fog moving in is showing us that the fog itself is very soft on the edges. It has no real edges, but I want you to notice what's causing that. It's the gradation. It's a combination of what the particles of water are doing and how the light is revealing that. But it's revealing the actual fog in gradation. And you can see the difference between that and when we see where there is no fog, we see contrast. Well, contrast is the opposite of gradation. So as you let your eye bathe the entire scene here, you can discover that it is the gradation of the elements of fog, of the gradation of the values that show us fog, that enable us to actually see it as fog and then interpret it as fog. Another function of how light affects value gradation is to show us aerial perspective. Aerial perspective refers to how things change as they move into distance. And specifically for this lesson, it refers to how values or value relationships change as they move into distance. Now, this is more easily seen when we blur. A scene is in effect the same thing as when you squint at a scene. Now we can see more clearly how those values in the distance are lighter. But what is more difficult to recognize is how they get gradually lighter. Let's blur that to extreme. Now it's easy to see. What's really happening there is that the overall scene is gradating gradually. When we throw everything totally out of focus, we can see that the whole area is gradually changing from the darks being darker here and then gradually, watch it right here, gradually getting lighter as they go into distance. And well, the lights always pretty much remain the same, but that gradation, because the darks get lighter as they go into distance, it feels like an overall gradation, with the main gradation or the main center of the gradation being right here. So really, all this around the edge is darker and gradually changes to lighter as it moves into the distance. Now, when we can comprehend that that is what's behind the scenes we're looking at, then we can really communicate the value gradation, that how the light affects the value gradation as images move into the distance. Here's another example of a totally different subject with the same principle at work. How the light is causing a gradual gradation from things up closer to us to things in the distance. Now, it's not really evident when we're looking at the scene in total focus. Let's throw it extremely out of focus now and show you that principle at work. Here it is. Now you can see how when we throw it totally out of focus, we can see the actual gradation. Watch this, the actual value gradation that is it's a gradual change from dark to lighter from all directions, moving from here into here, moving from here into here, moving from here into here, where the brightest part of that is right here, and that's where the light is the brightest. Our being able to see that underlying principle, this is underlying, the gradation itself is underlying everything else that's going on, underlying all the contrast that's going on, all the details that are going on. This is underlying that. We see that principle in nature almost everywhere where we can see distance. And this is learning how to do this, to make this happen in our paintings, is one thing I want to show you in this lesson. But the other thing I want to show you is how light rays, whether direct or indirect, cause gradation. They cause gradation within whatever the overall light source is doing. Now, in the aerial perspective, it's the overall light source that causes the whole scene to feel like it's moving towards the light in gradation. But let's look within that gradation. What happens within that gradation that is actually caused by the light rays? Let's do a little experiment here. What I just described to you was gradation within gradation caused by the light. Well, let's take both the blurred version and the totally focused version and show you how that works. So if you look at the blurred version, this is the version that's the underlying gradation that creates that aerial perspective. And so we can barely see that there is very subtle gradation of light moving to dark, light moving to darker, we might say. Let's go in that same area in the total in focus version, pretty much about right in here. Now, squint at this area, and when you squint and you squint those details out, you see what we just saw in the blurred version. You see it going totally out of focus. But what's causing that? What's causing it is that how the light is striking those little individual shapes. The light is kind of flooding over those little individual shapes. Where they are bending towards the light is capturing them. Where they are moving away from the light, they're going into a little bit of shadow. And there probably is a little bit of pigmentation going on there too. But you see how very close that is. And yet you have lighter gradually going into darker, gradually going into lighter, in that light end of the value scale. We could spend the entire workshop just analyzing various parts of just this one subject. But let's take just a couple of other parts and point out to you. The whole concept is I want you to learn how to see how the light rays cause the gradation. And maybe the difference between gradation and contrast. But let's do this. Let's move this over. And this time, let's bring it down. Well, in fact, let's just bring it down right here in this corner. Right down there. That's one of the darkest areas in the whole scene. Now, that makes it easier for us to see the underlying gradation. That's the perspective gradation, the area perspective gradation that we talked about. The underlying gradation, and we can see darker to lighter, how it gradually flows. Now let's keep that in mind. Let's move this over into that same area or a similar area, as close as we can get it to about that similar area of the scene itself. And about right in there, I guess. Now, squint really big. Now you see, when you squint at something like this, you don't see the whole thing going out of focus the way we saw the whole thing going out of focus here. Why is that? Because the gradation is further apart. The darks and the lights are further apart. Not only that, but in this particular area, we have a combination of gradation and contrast. And we can hardly teach one without teaching the other because they work together in everything we do in painting. But what we can look at there is what's actually happening within what's the light actually doing to cause the gradation. Now this is mostly in shadow, unlike this part up here. This is mostly in shadow, but it has indirect light rays. Up here we have the direct light rays. Down here we have the indirect light rays. All the light is behind all this. And yet at the same time we have these very subtle gradations. The gradation in the water, as the water is reflecting the sky, so we see that gradation in the water. We see the gradation on the sides of the buildings. Every portion, every image has that little bit of gradation in it. I want to take a look now at a totally different kind of image and show you how these principles all work together. You can see in this one, I didn't bring it to the quite extreme blur that I took the other images we've been working with, but I brought it to enough blur so that you can see the underlying gradation, that we feel almost a tug of the light in all the areas where there is light. We see that tug of light moving into shadow, and we can see that it is a gradual movement. Now if we look at the more in focus version over here, we can see that with the images brought into focus, there is contrast where the street is reflecting, because it's a wet street, it's reflecting the light. So we have reflected light here. And we can see that reflected light is actually gradating. We can see where it gets further down here. We can see that it's gradating towards the stronger light that's hitting that surface. Over here we see it more in shadow, but because the shadow because it has that reflective quality, we see these subtle gradations that are going on in here. Gradations within contrast. You see, even in this area right in here, you see a subtle gradation of darker to lighter. Now here it feels flat, but if we were there looking at that subject, we would see some slight gradations in the shadow here. And even in the light area up here, it feels flat. But if we were there in person, looking at this, we would see a slight bit of gradation. And then we see within these buildings, it's the overall buildings, you notice as they are closer or the further into distance, they are actually lighter. And then as they get way further away from that light, the buildings become darker, or we see stronger contrast. But why don't you notice little areas like this? Now I'm going to bring the little isolator down again. And I want you to notice in these areas here, how the light, where the light is the strongest, it's actually gradating out. And even in this little area right here, we see a slight gradation out. And so the idea there is to pay attention. Now, it's important which value areas those gradations, in which value areas those gradations are taking place. So it's important that in this area here, we can see that the gradation is closer in value to this area right in here. We can see as we move this over, right over here, we can see that the gradations are closer in value to this area right in here. We can move this comparison up. Now here we see the gradations in the buildings. The gradations in the buildings are closer to about right in here. But you can see that they are closer in relationship, but they're lighter as they move into distance. Let's bring it over and show one more area. Let's bring it right up here where we see both contrast and gradation, but you see gradation within contrast. Now you see we're in that pretty much that full range of the value scale, where the areas around here are located about in this area of value scale, but the areas right in here are located closer to this area in value scale. Now we have to be careful that when we're doing those, where there are strong contrast gradations. And when I say strong contrast, the actual overall area is contrasted with what's inside, but there is a gradation that's leading from one to the other because of the nature of the light. We have to be careful that we don't take these too light. Our temptation would be to go way over here because we would call it light. But you see, it's not that light. When you compare the two, you can see that it's really more, the degree of value is really more in this area right here. So we're dealing with controlling the values, controlling the value area we're working with, and observing what's going on within that area. Is that light gradating? Is it a close gradation? Is it a wider gradation? Is there gradation there? Is there a strong light that within it is gradating into a stronger dark? It's just a matter of observation. So we've learned in this little summary that light causes gradations in two different ways. It causes us to see the form, the gradation itself, the way the light is gradating, causes us to see the form of all shapes rather than just to read them as flat shapes themselves. And it causes us to see atmosphere, various kinds of atmosphere in nature, whether it's atmosphere caused by how the sun rays are coming through, or how a fog is falling, or simply more of a clearer atmosphere that shows us how things move into distance. So we can safely say that light rays, whether direct or indirect, cause gradation. When we can learn that, when we can learn to see that gradation, whether it's behind, where it's sort of an invisible gradation that is behind everything in the scene, or whether it's a gradation that's following a form, enabling us to read the form, or whether within that background gradation we have internal gradations. It doesn't matter. All these things play together. And when we can learn to just simply look at images in terms of what the light rays are doing to the image, the gradations, it's the gradations that the light rays are causing in the image. When we can learn to look for that within our images, then our painting goes to a totally higher level.
There's always two things going on. One thing we're not always so aware of, and that's how the overall, if we have a single light source, the overall scene that we're looking at with that just a single light source, things are actually gradating very subtly towards that light. That's the underlying gradation I was talking about. And then the things that are closer or further in the distance, because they're further in the distance, they're catching more of that light, and also there's atmosphere between us. They're much closer in value, gradating much closer in value. Things that are closer to us are further apart in value. So the gradations that are taking place, the things that are closer to us, the gradations that are taking place are actually further apart than the same thing is if it's further in the distance. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianneMize.com where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.